Hey folks, I'm Lucy at Ballyhoo Creations, and this video series is all about tips and tricks for making dolls and puppets. This video is about tools, but check out the other videos in the series to see if there's anything else you want to learn or get a refresher on. So let's get a close look at some of the tools you might want to have. The first tool to mention is something that does your sewing for you. Either a needle and thread if you're hand sewing, or a sewing machine if you want to machine sew, or you could also use an embroidery machine, which is my tool of choice. It's kind of like my robot that does my stitching for me. This is a big embroidery machine. You could use a smaller one too, it really doesn't matter. But you need something to stitch your fabric together. So whether that's a machine or your hand, you gotta have something to sew with. As far as needle and thread, this is a typical needle and thread for sewing by hand. You can barely even see the needle here on my table, and the thread is very thin and wimpy, and I do not recommend using these for hand sewing a doll or puppet. You need something a lot more sturdy. And what I'm going to talk about is a heavy-duty thread. There are different ones that you can use, extra strong upholstery, there's a button and craft you can get, or even a heavy-duty like a hand quilting thread is heavier or stronger than a regular sewing thread. So don't use this unless it's absolutely your only choice. You want something strong and sturdy. Also for needles, we have a lot of different needles, anywhere from a 5-inch doll needle like this one. I mean, look at the difference there. I like to use about a 3 or 4-inch like this. These needles, that's actually a big fat one. They have skinnier ones too. So you've got different kinds of needles, and these are good because they can go all the way through a doll part. Say you're stitching an arm on and it'll go all the way through the arm or things like that. And then you also have another option of things like curved needles, and those come in different sizes too. So when you're stitching with heavy fabrics and you need to put a lot of tension on your thread, look into a bigger needle and a heavy-duty thread. These can be a big game changer. It's horrible if you've stitched the entire opening of a doll, or you've stitched something onto your puppet or whatever, and then you pull the thread tight and you're almost finished and the thread breaks and you have to redo the whole thing. With a strong thread, that fabric will probably break before the thread, so get a good thread and get a heavy-duty needle to use with it. Same thing goes for your sewing machine. The more money you spend on a machine, the more features, bells and whistles it's going to have, and probably the better it's going to work for you. So find something within your budget, but at the top end of your budget. Buy as much sewing machine as you can afford. You'll have the best results that way. Scissors. Don't run with them, but get good ones. There are a lot of different kinds of scissors that you can use. I'm just going to throw some on the table here and talk about all the different kinds of scissors. Wait, there's more. There's more. Okay, so we've got our basic fabric shears, and you want a nice heavy-duty pair for that so that they cut fabric easier. If your scissors are dull, you will have a very tough time, so make sure you keep your scissors sharp. Get a good pair. You also might want a small pair of scissors for making small nips, cutting out hands or things like that. And also when you're cutting fur, you can just cut the backing with a small pair of scissors like this rather than using a razor blade, which I have no control over a razor blade, but I have a lot of control with the little scissors. And then you have other specialty scissors. These are for applique if you're into that. They get right up on the edge of the fabric. These are bandage scissors, so if you need to cut through one layer but not both, this will not dig in to the bottom fabric, so that's a nice thing if you do a lot of that. And of course, applique or embroidery scissors, these are curved, so they get right down on the surface, and especially if you have an embroidery hoop, this is out of the way of the embroidery hoop, so you can get right in there and make all of your cuts. You can cut right down at the surface of the fabric, so these are a great pair to have too. But really what you need is definitely a good pair of fabric scissors that you only use for fabric and nothing else. And then I would also recommend that you have at least a small pair for more intricate cuts. Hemostats, probably my favorite tool in this entire thing, is to share the joy of hemostats, because they have these grippy jaws that grip your fabric, and then they lock here at the top, so you can get the fabric in there and then lock them, and they're great for turning things right side out. They're also really good when you need to stuff in tight places. They come in different sizes, and this is important because you need to have a pair of hemostats that match the size of your project. If you're doing a really tiny doll hand, then you would want to have a tiny pair of hemostats to get up in those fingers. If you're doing something that's long and straight, then the longer pair of hemostats are better for doing something like that. And then of course the medium pair, and these aren't even expensive, I'm not gonna lie. These cost under $3 at Walmart. They're in the fishing aisle. So anybody should be able to get a pair similar to this. And they're about a 5-inch pair of hemostats. They even have a coated handle. They have a nice locking mechanism up here. And they don't rip the fabric because they have a nice wide jaw. And that's another thing to mention. If you only have the small pair and you're trying to turn large things right side out, all you're going to do is rip holes in your fabric because these are too small and sharp. These are for really tiny parts. If you have larger parts to turn, then you want to use a larger jaw. So size the jaw of the hemostats with the size of your project. That's very important. Hemostats were a game changer for me. Turning things right side out used to be the biggest chore because I'd try to use a chopstick or something, or I can't do it. I can't. And then I got these and learned how to use them, and like the whole world opened up, and I encourage everyone to use these now. And because they're so cheap, like $3, there's no excuse. Just get them. Why make your life more difficult when you can spend $3 and make your life easier? I don't know. Just get them. Tools for working with wire are optional, but if you are working with wire or armature wires for your dolls or puppets, then definitely you need at least some needle nose pliers. And these do have a built-in cutter, so you can use this as your wire cutter. That works fine. Less than $10 for a pair like this. And then I also have this pair of wire nippers that you can get right down on the surface and cut your wire where you want it. So I like to use these for cutting the armature wire instead of the wire cutter here, because you have to like get distance to cut the wire on these. So again, wire cutting and shaping tools are highly recommended. If you are working with armature wire, you have to have some of these, at least the needle nose pliers. Glue. Even if you sew all the time, it is good to have at least one fabric glue, maybe a couple. If you're only going to use one fabric glue, I would recommend either Fabri-Fix or Fabri-Tac, which is made by Beacon. This stuff works really great for fabric. It holds it. It can go through the wash without coming apart, in a gentle wash at least, and it is not too noxious to work with. There are other kinds of fabric, like this is a Fabric Fuse from E6000. Here's an Eileen's Flexible Stretchable Fabric Glue. These don't grab the fabric as quickly and they take longer to dry. These are harder for me to work with, so I don't tend to use those. Fabri-Fix is what I typically reach for, or Fabri-Tac. I used to hate glue guns. I always burned my fingers. I always got blobs of glue, and then I switched over to the Surebonder fine tip of glue gun that has this really nice tip here. It doesn't have to be the Lynn Lily. They also have the green and black Surebonder fine tip and the Surebonder fabric glue sticks. And this combination with the fine tip and the fabric glue stick is wonderful. I have actually started using this more than the Fabri-Fix because it grabs faster. And then you might also consider a glue stick. This is good as just a temporary basting to hold fabrics temporarily, maybe while you're sewing or doing applique or something. I like to use a glue stick for that. Totally optional, but they're so cheap, it's nice to have them close by. Here's the thing about fabric glues, they are really a personal preference. People love certain brands and not others. You may love glue guns, you might hate them. You might like the Fabri-Fix, you might hate it. You might never ever use a glue at all because you prefer needle and thread. It's all your choice on how you do it. Just know what's out there and what's available, and experiment if you want to or not. Oh, one other thing about glues, if you're making puppets, you'll hear a lot of people talk about contact cement for making puppets. And yes, that is an option and it works very well. I choose not to use it because of the toxic fumes that contact cement puts off, and also because I tend to make patterns for people who have craft rooms that don't use things like contact cement. It's not something that the typical crafter has in their craft room or sewing room, so I tend to use things like the Fabri-Fix or the hot glue instead because people typically have that. My audience has that. But if you want to use contact cement, go ahead. Just make sure that you use it in a well-ventilated area, and just opening a window isn't enough. You have to actually have airflow that take the fumes away from you, not towards you. So keep that in mind if you are going to work with the contact cement. It's really kind of, toxic stuff, and I can't stand breathing it, so I don't use it. But you can. It looks like a hair clip, but, well, it is a hair clip, but I'm going to show you how to use it for sewing as well. Clips and clamps and pins, these are all things that will hold your fabric together while you are sewing or gluing. You can get regular fabric sewing pins like these small ones here. You could also use T-pins, which are stronger if you're doing faux fur and want a pin. This is a nice sturdy pin for a heavy-duty fabric. Those are called T-pins. Then you could also use these fabric clips. These are Clover. There's generic brands too, and they're for smaller pieces. There are bigger ones like this. You could even use the clothespins or the mini clothespins that you find at like the dollar store. Those could be used as clips. And if you have more heavy-duty things, or for foam, when I'm gluing foam, I like to use these hair clips. And they're a nice, I mean, they have a good spring in them and they will hold things together, but they're not overly heavy. Like a hardware store clamp is a little bit too heavy, too grippy, but the clamp is just a light spring, so it won't hurt your head and your hair. It's good for keeping foam together for gluing a puppet, or also for holding fabric pieces together while you want to stitch them. And then just make sure you pull these things out of the way before you stitch. Even with pins, it's not a good idea to stitch over them. That if you are in the habit of doing that, after you break several needles, you will get out of that bad habit, hopefully. So it's better to just take all this stuff off, don't stitch over it. There are a lot of options for marking fabric. There are air erasable pins that disappear just over time. There are heat erasable. It looks like a ballpoint pen, but when you iron it, the marks go away. There are also water soluble ones. There's chalk, of course, the old school chalk like this, or you can get a chalk marker that I've had it open the whole time, but it doesn't dry out. So it's a chalk wheel like that for a better precision. Or if you're old school, this is a tracing wheel and some paper that when you run it over the fabric, it leaves a mark on the fabric. This is not so great for doll making. I don't typically use that. That's really old school dressmaker stuff. But for marking on heavier fabrics like fleece, especially if you're using a heavy fabric, even a Sharpie can work as long as your fabric is thick enough that it won't bleed through to the good side. So faux fur or fleece is thick enough that you can use a light Sharpie to mark the back side only of your fabric, but also consider things like the air erasable, the heat erasable, or the chalk, because a lot of times you need to put a mark on your fabric and you don't want it to stay there forever. Measuring tools, obviously you're going to need something to measure with. You can use just a plain ruler. I highly recommend getting at least a flexible tape measure, because the tape measure can measure around curves. You can do the same thing with this flexible tape measure. It's actually not a tape measure, the flexible ruler, and it's got, you know, inches and centimeters on either side like a lot of rulers do, but this one bends and then it will hold its shape, whereas this tape will not. And this is good if you're doing your own designing of patterns. And for example, when I do puppet mouths, I can measure the mouth on the face and then go, okay, this is how big I need the mouth plate to be. It's easy to use something like this. And then another measuring tool, if you're not familiar with a lot of old school seamstress stuff, this is a seam gauge. And it's good for, you can measure between this point and this little blue mark here, tells you exactly how big like your seam allowance is. So, or small measurements. It's a cheap little gauge to have for small measurements. Totally optional, but I recommend you get both. A seam ripper for when things go wrong, because they always seem to, and an awl, AWL, not an ALL, but an AWL for poking holes in your fabric. A lot of people will tell you to cut a hole in the fabric. I don't suggest that, because the awl will actually slide in between the threads and push them apart so that you have fewer broken threads, and that hole where you're putting like a doll joint or a doll eye or something like that is more likely to stay in longer because you didn't break as many threads. So an awl for poking holes and a seam ripper for ripping seams when you have a mistake. And last but not least at all is a tape roller, because when you're making dolls and puppets, especially if you're working with fleece, fur, minky, you're going to get that stuff all over you, and a tape roller is excellent to get it off of you, your work surface, and your doll or your puppet. That's all I had to share on tools and materials. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about scissors and hemostats. We talked about an awl and a seam ripper. We talked about needle and thread, sewing machine, We talked about measuring and marking. We talked about wire cutting tools. Of course, we talked about the tape roller for cleanup at the end or during, whatever. If you enjoyed this video, check out my designs and patterns at ballyhoocreations.com and look for other videos in this series to learn more about making dolls and puppets. Everything is linked below this video to help you find everything fast and easy.